To our final guest, he wrote that piece about Jimmy Savile and the paedophile culture of light entertainment. He wrote that piece about Julian Assange and ghosting. Every piece he writes is that good. As a writer, he ranges widely, combining memoir and investigative journalism to devastating effect. In The Missing, he is posed as Marilyn Monroe's Maltese Terrier, and most recently he's taken us to Blackpool and Afghanistan in the utterly fantastic The Illuminations. I'm thrilled that he's chosen the salon for the very first reading from his new, as yet unfinished novel. It is called Caledonian Road, and he is Andrew O'Hagan.
Optimistically high for a short ass sketch. So I'm going to read something first, right?
Yes.
This is, as Damian beautifully says, it's from, not only is this unpublished, it's almost entirely unwritten at the moment. But it's highly conceived, as we like to say. That's to say it's dreamed of. My publishers will kill me. Don't tell them, by the way. Don't tweet. They'll kill me that I've come out at his instigation to read from an unpublished work. But anyway, here goes. This is the opening of this new book, Caledonian Road, as it will be. The children woke, and Daddy wasn't there. That was the story. The only story that mattered, and Mum was a bottomless pit of neediness. Then Dad died after 40 years, and Piccadilly was almost pink with promise as Campbell stepped from the car. He always ordered the most expensive Uber. It made him stronger, he said to himself. It made him handsome. And every day is a growth day if you know how to read your own past. It was the autumn after the funeral, and Campbell felt fully audible to himself as he crossed and walked under the Ritz's golden bulbs, talking into his phone. Self-pity is a disastrous mode of thought, he said to his elder brother. I gave it up at the age of 40, Ewan, and I've never looked back. You'll have to move on. You're coming to the Commons next week, and that's a fresh beginning anyhow. Campbell held out his phone and let his brother's objections melt into air. He and Ewan had always made such a success of what they didn't say, and it seemed too risky to begin arguing now. He lifted his wrist and got a blast of Paco Rabanne. A perfume expert told him that men should always smell a little grim. No flowers, but a skin that can faintly remember its own sweat and know about cars, spices, tobacco. You're right, Ewan, he said. England is gone. Dead, actually. Campbell was 45 that summer, a never married, 6'2", prize-winning biographer, the London editor of the New York Times Magazine, a moralist in his head, a blackguard in his life, the best fun in Britain, a half-decent turn in the feathers, and a life-writing hero in his third year as professor of box sets at the London School of Economics. He wore a beautiful dark suit. At the corner of St. James's Street, he bent down to wipe a scuff off his shoes, and feeling a rush of red buses, he experienced the mastery of self that comes with a good shoe. He would normally have lit a cigarette at this point in the street, but he'd said goodbye to all that, standing now like Beerbohm Tree sans cheroot naked without smoke, but happy in his tobacco-respecting cologne, knowing he would one day be just another of London's vanished figures. Yet the world belonged to Campbell as he made his way to the same old table at the Wolseley. He'd enjoyed, a long self-government in, it was an apprenticeship, really, in self-government. And now he was free. The dark comedy of being a professional biographer, a wily essayist, a hard-working man of letters, had finally opened onto an open field of glorious sunshine where he might walk every day, unhindered by the crippling responsibility of a growing reputation. He knew 100 writers who toiled in a state of compressed fear and stylistic torpor, all of them desperate in their careful ways and agonized that they might be forgotten or never, Jesus Christ, win a prize. Oh, darlings, the indignity. What the mess of life and its blaze of events. Jesus, they were all that mattered on the page. He was stable in his art. And so it was that the infertility of the literary life had come to seem hilarious to him. The invitations on the mantelpiece, the sordid little book party bathed in warm Chardonnay, the small dinner, the book signing, the Nether Wallop Literary Festival, the lifeless introductions to deathless classics. Campbell, when young, was a reliable source of the sudden, vapid column of feeling, the literary excursion to the heart of the matter that made editors' pulses race. He did the radio shows, the TV essays, the brilliantly nonsensical forewords to artists' catalogues. He'd once been a master of the plangent school visit, had done several years' hard labor on the Arvon courses, appeared in person before audiences in Sydney and Jaipur. Oh, the love, the audiences, the honor. While other people were living their lives, Campbell was in an airport lounge waiting for a sad flight to Latvia. He'd written books that, quote, changed the meaning of the well-written life, Mail on Sunday, and was, quote, the best essayist of his generation, the Wall Street Journal. And now he was done. He hadn't seen, and neither had his variously brilliant colleagues and friends, how empty their little culture was, how unsupported, until one morning he woke up and said no to everything. Everything. He wouldn't be one of them. The talented civil servants of literature, grey of complexion and bad of shoe, sniffing out reassurance in every department of life and waiting earnestly, for their OBE. No, he was saying no. In all those years of high-flying moralism and career success, Campbell forgot he was a natural arson, and he entered the restaurant with a delicate passion for life and fire. On his way over to Jonathan, our hero had stopped and kissed a number of people who had something against him. He wasn't thought to have enemies. Indeed, he was famously liked and was considered almost culpably happy. Yet a number of people felt oddly unsettled by Campbell Flynn, as if his busy good nature had somehow failed them by not spreading itself more specifically in their direction. It was common to feel chided by his affability or simply left out. He was practically family with figures whose blessing and support most writers craved, and he hadn't invited them to anything or had them reviewed. Darling, he's the Kim Philby of the literary world, a popular gay novelist whispered to his companion after shaking Campbell's hand. Born in a Glasgow bin shed. He was the heartthrob of St Andrews, you know, thinks he's God, can barely write. And now he has daily meetings in the Athenaeum where he decides our fate. Jesus. He sat down, and Jonathan winked at him from the center of a crucial call. The agent was talking to a former Labour frontbencher who wanted to write a series of children's books about the financial crisis. Oh, how lovely, darling, absolutely. I mean, the Victorian poor are massive, massive right now. I mean, and chimneys, oh my God, and wolves, oh, most definitely. What? Whitechapel, oh, darling, perfect, I must say. A bit of Downton thrown in, definitely. This kind of thing, I mean, kitchens, darling. Oh, the terrible secrets. Oh, money. Tell you what, let's just jot down a few ideas and we'll email Ebury on Monday. It's a series, Norman. I'm telling you, it's a series. You'll have the Smarties prize under your belt before you get to book 3. Who was that? Campbell said. One of our ludicrous former legislators, Jonathan said, wants to rewrite Oliver Twist as a way of explaining subprime mortgages to infants. Will it sell? By the thousand, my friend. And oh, the Americans. Campbell just shook his head and ordered a glass of Tattinger. His escape route from literary world was well underway, but in hearing such tales of marketing genius, he often became nostalgic for the former world, the sacred afternoons spent among the stacks in his favourite corner of the London Library, the months taking notes for essays that only a few hundred would read. He had emerged from all that biographical work as a man without a biography. And he began to hope that Jonathan wouldn't ask him, please don't, to take another contract. How are you enjoying being the greatly rewarded and hugely respected professor of box sets? It's lovely, Campbell said. Then he smiled. I suppose you'd respect me more if I was teaching the Victorian novel 1836 to 1900. Not at all, my dear. You already suffer acutely from too much respect. I'd prefer to see you on Celebrity Big Brother myself. Don't hold your breath, Campbell said. The too much respect can make a stone of the heart, that's for sure. And I hear they wanted you to be head of the Royal Society of Literature. It's not happening, said Campbell. My biographies have set me free. They'll be writing your biography next. Like our friend Flaubert, I have no biography. Rubbish, sir. Rubbish! Just you wait, some young Oxford person is just hatching as we speak, a beautiful young blonde, no doubt, who'll be going through your knicker drawer in due course. He ordered herring, steak tartare, and a bottle of the Pinot Nero. Did you know Martha's novel about Maud Gonne was turned down by several publishers? That's shocking, Campbell said. I'm going to speak to Colin. She's one of the few people in this country actually interested in English prose and society. That's right. And all those shameful publishers want is a grim copy of something that was unaccountably successful last year. They made themselves feel better by talking about the actors and producers who had turned Campbell's books into films. I'm with Horace, Campbell said at last. Work alone, keep to the study, gather from nature, like the bees. I think those successful children of yours have turned your head, Jonathan said. Campbell sighed. You know something, Jonathan? In the 1800s, among the reasons a person could be admitted to the Trans-Allegheny lunatic asylum, along with bad company, the war, and business nerves, was reading literature. Really? You could be put away for reading good books. That's right. And poems. It drove people mad. The agent filled their glasses. With a cascade of stubby fingers, he said hello to another agent across the room. Fascinating, he said. He wondered if this would be a good time to broach the subject of the royalties-only e-book deal offered by Newsweek, or the invitation to host the Cambridge seminars, or the letter about introducing Jude the Obscure for nothing. Campbell sat up and shook his head. But it's all over, isn't it, Jonathan? What's over? Hardback books, literary biography, novels, decent advances, independent bookshops, a spread of authors, the idea of high culture. Well, the idea of high culture speaking to political reality, Jonathan. There is, I admit, Jonathan said, a significant downward pressure on advances. I've been meaning to talk to you about that. A drama critic from The New Yorker came over to compliment Campbell in a recent essay he'd written about the paranoid sublime in Mr. Robot. For a second, while the man stood there with his small, shining head and his brand new teeth, Campbell wondered to what degree his reputation was simply an aspect of other people's fear. And the thought merged as the critic spoke with an image of a bowl of fruit as painted by Claude Monet. To be sure, Campbell felt himself disappearing in a happy haze as he sat on the banquette, not listening to the man, but seeing how the color of Monet's apple is changed by the yellowness of the adjacent peach.
What an incredible privilege that was, Mr. O'Hagan. I have to say, I was reading along as Andy was reading, and it's really a work in progress, isn't it? A lot's changed line by line.
Yeah, since yesterday.
That funeral wasn't mentioned. It was the last day of autumn when I read it, and now it's I think the last day of the day after the funeral.
It's one of the things, as you know yourself, you find is that, you're trying to wrestle this beast to the ground for 4 years, and every day is a new day of self-loathing, and a new day of addressing the problem. And so, it's actually quite nice reading something so early because, hearing it work with an audience is something that actually is a bit of a tonic.
How advanced are you with it? And is it a novel that you've already sold? Is it a novel you're expected to deliver?
It's a novel that's under contract.
So it's for Faber?
Yeah, it's
Editor's not here.
It's
checking.
Yeah, don't tell them. But
Safe space.
It's under contract to Faber here and in several other places. So, I'm well on with it, but I keep doubling back. I've always found that with writing of books that it's this weird dance with yourself that goes on for years. And I'm always going back to the beginning.
Right.
I was struggling to change a word at the beginning of the Illuminations as it was going off in its absolute final form.
Really?
I was still staring at the opening, saying, could I just take that beat down one?
It's so interesting because normally the beginning, or at least the thing that people first write, is the thing that they don't change. It's the kind of foundation stone. It's the Alexander stone of the rest of the book. But you're talking about going back and changing the place where you started.
The thing I often don't change is the end, actually. I usually write the end first.
Right.
I wrote the end of the Illuminations first.
Did you?
Yeah. I need to get all the tears over first. You know, I need to sort of sit and blub at my desk for a few hours before I sort of then clear my throat and go to the beginning.
Right.
So I intend to know what's going to happen at the end of these books. So
you know what happens at the end of this one?
I've got a strong idea, but I didn't actually write the sentences for the end in this one.
Right.
Because there was a few things that I was looking at. This is a big novel.
Big, like as in big, or big as in, right, chunky.
Yeah. I mean, for those of you who have never seen anything of mine before, I've never written a big book before. They've always been quite short. But, you know, there comes a moment where you realize that the subjects you're trying to wrap your arms around won't be served by 250 pages.
What is the subject you're trying to wrap your arms around?
Well, I suppose one of the things that's been said to me, I've been in this business for, I think, 25 years. Published my first book in my early 20s, and from that moment to this moment, there's a thing that's always been said to me by everybody in different countries, which is, why are none of your books funny?
This book is funny.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I wasn't ready to try to write that comic big novel that I felt. I mean, I think I had, to be honest with you, Damian, I felt I had to be older to write the book that I'm trying to write.
Right.
That's not to say the other books are immature, but they were chamber pieces, those books. There's a wonderful moment, Robert Gottlieb, the American editor, who was a big guy at Knopf and then an editor at the New Yorker for a number of years, has just published his memoir, and there's a great moment in that book where one of his long-standing authors at Knopf, Toni Morrison, where he just published a book of hers called Sula, and he said to, now you've written a number now of, you know, almost quartet pieces, like they're small chamber pieces, they're full of a certain delicacy, and you obviously had to write them that way, but now it's time to bring on the whole orchestra. And, you know, it's an incredibly sort of probably unwise thing to do, although it worked for her, you know, because Song of Solomon came next, as it were. Our beloved came next. You know.
So do you feel for you that is that about technical skill? Was that about confidence? Is that about just not caring?
I think you need to know more to write a book like that. I think one of the things that you don't know when you're 23 is that you don't really know anything. You know about one thing. You know about your girlfriend, or you know about how much you hated your parents, or how university was boring, you know. But can we tighten this? I feel it's slipping down or whatever. But you don't really know enough about what in the 19th century was quite freely and easily called society.
Yes.
You know, you don't know what the inside of a gentleman's club looks like. You don't know what it's like perhaps on the daily life on a housing estate in Huddersfield. You don't know, as that happens we do because we grew up on them, but you tend to not know enough of a spread of things unless you have a particular kind of imagination, as Dickens and Trollope did, although they did a lot of research constantly. And one of the things I've always been trying to instruct students when I've got them to do is to invest in research. I would always be amazed at students who would turn up, you know, to talk to you, and it would be clear that they'd never, ever in their whole lives been inside a factory. That's fine not to be in a factory if you just have no reason to go into one. But if you're a novelist, you ought to stop the bus, if you still take the bus. And they should. I remember Harold Pinter saying that his whole writing fell away when he stopped taking the bus. I've never forgotten that. But you know, the business of getting to know things, if you're going to write that big, capacious, baggy, you know, novel that was so endearing to the Victorians and perhaps isn't so looked for now among the reading public, I wonder why, but
I mean, you mentioned Trollope there when you were talking about it, and when we were talking on email, you'd said the main thing to know is just this big kind of Trollopian, I'm not sure if I'm saying the emphasis on the right place, Trollopian, my Trollope is rusty, kind of novel, and I started to think, what does he mean by that? Is he talking about the ambition in terms of the size of it? Is he obsessed? Is he thinking about money? Is he thinking about character? I was starting to think about what Trollope is known for. What is it that about him that has kind of attracted you at this point in your writing life, and what is it that the book's going to express of him?
I think that writers are always in conversation with their forebears. It's one of the things that you learn to be accepting about, I think. There are a lot of novelists in this room who have an ongoing dialogue with writers that they have loved. That's not to say you think you are them. I don't think I'm Trollope. He was a great master of a particular form of the British novel, and but I'm in dialogue with the notion that the country that we're living in today is capacious and perverse enough to merit a proper account, a big novel that actually tries to wrap itself around some of the deepest ironies, financial, moral, ethical, in terms of sexual identity. I've never read the novel that I want to read about the way we live now. So it would be sort of childish of me as a novelist of some standing in terms of time and effort not to take that on, especially as I've always been quite an enthusiastic journalist, as some of those Victorians were. So I've never been shy of going out. You mentioned at the top, about those pieces about Assange or paedophilia at the BBC. Those pieces each took me 8 or 9 months each.
How do you decide when you encounter a story like that, and a Savile or an Assange, and you find them, and how do you decide that you want to do it fictionally, or that you want to do it as a piece tentatively or purportedly of non-fiction, and how do you patrol that very porous boundary?
You know the answer to this yourself because you wrote Maggie and Me. Now that could have been anybody's first novel. A great success it was. He knows that. You all know that. It was a fantastic book, and that could have been a great beginning of a fiction writer's career. A person who grew up in that environment with ambivalent feelings about the political culture, about their own sexuality. But that is what is traditionally called Truman Capote's first novel, as it were, or anybody's first novel. But it's a non-fiction book. The answer to your question is that you know it on sight.
That was a choice.
Yeah. Well, as far as I'm concerned, every time when Julian Assange contacted me and said, I want you to help me write my book, well, I was just so intrigued by the idea of having access to a particular, very important, I thought, aspect of modern life, the relationship between individuals and power. Hardly a new subject, but new manifestations of it have occurred not only in our time, but in the last few years. And I thought, I'll certainly go and help him. But over the course of that experience, more and more of what he revealed to me about the nature of narcissism, about the nature of self-obsession, about the nature of distraction. Obviously, I began to think about that in relation to him as a separate book that I would write, or a piece that I would write, as it turned out. And I had the most fabulous notes. Journalistically, there's only maybe 3 or 4 times in your life as a non-fiction writer, if you're lucky, when you have notes that are actually just gold. You just know they're gold. And I lived with them for 3 years without publishing a single word of it. And at one point thought I never would. But they were so good.
Why did you think you never would? Why did you think you never would?
Because I felt quite loyal to him for quite a long time. And I knew that although I had never had any intention to ridicule him, I saw that he ridiculed himself. And there was a decision I had to make about whether I was going to allow him to be harmed by his own words and deeds, as I feel his reputation might be by the book. So it's the opposite of what you sometimes would imagine, or what some of the journalists imagined, which was that you set out to harm him. Actually, the opposite was the case. I set out to protect him, but I couldn't ultimately protect him from the truth. After all, wasn't he the man who set himself out to be the prince of a new way of identifying and relaying truth? So I felt it was entirely consistent with both our instincts to tell the truth about what that, in a documentary form, But it was never a novel for me, Damian. There was never a moment where I thought, oh, this would make a fabulous novel. I mean, Jonathan Franzen made a novel out of it. I mean, that material was available. And Jonathan Franzen was perfectly generous when I met him and recognizing that he'd read the material and he saw it as material for a novel. It was never material for a novel for me. I felt that you, the reader, wanted to be inside that actual house with that actual man while he was actually eating lasagna with his actual hands. And I was reporting it. I like the comedy of it as well, so I thought that might be lost in some overthought novel.
There's plenty of ludicrous comedy in it, and of course the lasagna eating with the hands is one of the things that
he denies that, by the way.
He denies that, the table manners.
It was amazing that that was the thing that offended him most. It seemed to me that sort of, you know, when you're dealing with this sort of possible portrayal of sort of, you know, grade A narcissism with an international impact, that your table manners might be a kind of afterthought when it came to what offended you most, but that was the only thing.
But I think that's because it's one of the things that's real, and one of the things that could be verified as real by the people around him. And I think that is tangible. You know, you can hear it, you can see it, you can smell it. You say of him, yet it hadn't felt like creating a character in a novel so much as writing a voiceover for a real person who isn't quite real. And that sentence really stood out in that piece for me.
I think that not only the Assange story, but it was true of the BBC story as well, where I had to keep quiet. I had two sources who were ingrained in the whole BBC culture, who, amidst the hysteria of people talking about paedophilia at the BBC and surrounding the hysteria around individual characters, and a kind of tabloid frenzy that we often see in this country, that there was a deeper story of a longer-term, historical, almost clubbable society of abuse at the BBC. And the material was so, new that I had to sit with it a long time and had to protect those sources for a long time. But to bring us back round, I mean, when you're involved in that kind of research, hunger, if you like, doesn't stop when it comes to writing a novel. You're just you're storing up the energy for the moment when you merge the two sides of the two moons that you have going, you know. And I've never actually, although I've written 5 novels, I've never written a novel that was based on material in society. I'd always just focused on one group of characters and stayed with them. So, it's a new direction.
So who are the group of characters in society that the new novel is based on? Where are Campbell and his kind living, and why is it called Caledonian Road?
Well, one of the things that's never left me, nothing ever leaves you as a novelist. I mean, I was looking at material. I had to move boxes in the country the other day, and I saw that I've now got 45 boxes of material that I've just collected over the years, including report cards from school and nonsense that some of it's quite good, though. I mean, the report cards are hilarious because, do you remember, you'll know this, that in Ayrshire schools, they used to, no matter what it said in your grade box, the worst thing that could happen to you is that the teacher could write something across your whole report card, and it was always 2 words, easily distracted. Remember that? And every single one of my report cards has easily distracted written across, and one of them has an asterisk, and you go to the bottom, it says, he loves being the class clown. Unfortunately, they like it too. That's where novels start. But material, building it up over the years and realizing that it would be used in a novel eventually. And I noticed that, for example, that in one of the boxes, I'd taken a lot of notes when I lived at King's Cross in the 90s. Yeah. I used to, as many of you will know, King's Cross is a different world now. But if you remember how it was in 1992, when there was those cobbled streets behind King's Cross Station and those gasometers, as we called them in the north, and the Regent's Canal, and it was a very different world. And I lived there for a few years and got to know a lot of the women who worked in those streets.
How?
In a professional capacity. And they were always just like, I know you're supposed to think how horrific, how desperate, but they just seemed like girls that I went to school with, a lot of those girls. You would have thought that.
They probably were girls that I'd gone to school with in my case of my school, but anyway.
You knew you well. No, they were always chatty, and I started interviewing them and stuff. So I collected material even then, not
So
quite
can I
knowing.
just go back a wee minute? Like you started interviewing them. How does that work? You walk up to somebody, a woman who's working in the street behind King's Cross, and you just say, "I want to talk to you," and they go, "Yeah, you all do. It's £95." Right? I mean, like, where does that impulse come from, and how do you have that?
Well, you know that
interaction?
Ayrshire phrase, he'd get a piece at any door. It was a bit like that. I mean, I've always had, it's my luckiest trait, I have to tell you, in my opinion, it's my luckiest trait as a writer, is that I can always talk to people. I've never had any trouble with it. I've been, in so many of those situations where you would expect it would be impossible. But I just keep going back. I mean, I kept going back to the girls. I mean, they would say when you're going back, you're looking for business and all that, and I'd stop. I mean, I was 22, so of course I was looking for business, but not necessarily from them, and I had no money anyway. But I remember stopping and saying, how long you been here? And they'd be like, oh, who you're the cops and all that. And after a few months, they'd get to see you, and then we'd sit down, and then I used to bring them tea down from my flat, and then we'd smoke out in the street, and then I started inviting them in. I mean, it became quite detailed. And of course, it was a nightmare for anybody who'd walk in, and they'd be like, why has he got all the hookers in his flat? My mother lived in Scotland, so that was okay. I don't know, I've just always found it necessary to get the material. I've never guessed anything as a writer. I think you need to get the material.
Do you think? I mean, you say of Campbell, he was born near Glasgow or in a Glasgow bin shed, and that's much more like where you were born and where I was born. Do you think that having that kind of background of nowhere and undeniably of nothing makes it easier for you to have those conversations, to ask those questions? I
remember right at the beginning of my career, I published an essay in the London Review of Books. It was at the time, many of you will remember this, I'm sure, of the murder of James Bulger by those two 10-year-old boys in Liverpool. And there was this almost festival of gleeful hatred in the tabloid press, trying to create, I would argue, 3 tragedies where there was already one. And they were determined, they were publishing photographs of nooses with the boys' X in them and so on. And there was a kind of festival of vengeance going on. And I went to Liverpool, and I went to the trial, and I was quite young, 1993, and March 1993. And I ended up writing this essay about my own childhood, about growing up in a housing estate in Ayrshire, and how a certain degree, different in degree from what they'd done, but not different in essence from what they'd done, which was to blur the relationship between reality and imagination so far that a culture of violent, recriminatory abuse became a kind of normalcy for them. And I wrote this essay, and it caused mayhem overnight. They published it in the London Review, and then I remember The Guardian bought it to republish, and it was one of the most unfortunate headlines I've ever had in my career. It was on the front page of The Guardian that said, "Confessions of a Literary Editor." And it was a picture of me looking incredibly thuggish and guilty. But it was a piece about what it was like to grow up in a culture where, you didn't there were no novelists in the world to you. There were no playwrights. You didn't bump into poets. I mean, this isn't a prolier than thou competition. It's just, it was like that. There was nobody there who did that. And I remember Alan Bennett phoned me up and he said, with a childhood like that, you'll never run out of things to write about.
And is that why so far you haven't written what you might call a straightforward memoir?
I just couldn't write a memoir with my parents still alive. My father's dead, but I couldn't do it to my mother.
Why?
Too painful for her.
For her? Okay.
Too painful for her, certainly. And my brothers, I think that, I've come to an agreement with my brothers that, a writer is a particular kind of beast, and it's difficult for, I know that you have had experiences that are, raw in this department. It's no easy matter. If you live in a literary culture and we all come to a beautiful thing like this, a salon, or we read books regularly and we have an account with Amazon, you don't know what it would be like necessarily to live in a world where books are an enormous threat and a species of grassing. And there are cultures where that exists, and I'm afraid, although my brothers have been enormously supportive, and so had my mother and my father, I think they found it quite painful, even in the small amount that I have dealt in. So I couldn't go the full hog and describe what it was like in the 1970s. I just wouldn't do that to them. I mean, Evelyn Waugh said a famous thing that I've never forgotten, which is, and I believe it, he said, when a writer's born into the family's finished. And I've tried my hardest not to allow that to be true.
But is it not also the case that even if they were all gone or just not listening or not reading, that also there's something about you wanting to protect the source of you, of the stories that shaped and made you?
That's an interesting question, Damian, because as you know, it's very easy in this business, and there was that I think for the first 5 years of my career, every single time the phone rang, it was somebody from The Spectator or the New York Review of Books asking me to climb into a hole in Paisley and write a 12,000-word piece about it. In other words, you quickly become the expert on poor people. And even by that point, I was living in London, I'd been to university, The world of poor people is a very different world now, even from what it was then. But we don't need to get into that. But I mean, maybe one of the reasons I want to write this big novel now is to finally try to address some of that. But, you spend a lot of your time not wanting to be this sort of poverty correspondent for The Guardian.
Yeah, well, it's like...
Not that they're running out of people who are already in that role, but, I certainly was never going to be happy doing it.
No, and me neither, just like I don't want to be the gay correspondent or make anybody else the whatever correspondent. How does your journalism feed into the new book, into this big new sprawling...
I think it's gave me an enormous amount of confidence about going into the world and finding out things and bringing them back for the book. I mean, Tom Wolfe, who was never a great favourite of mine, he nevertheless has said one or two important things, I think, to offer other writers. And one of them was that you have to get out of the house if you're going to be a contemporary novelist. If you're the kind of contemporary novelist who's writing about a particular relationship inside a family, maybe you sit at your desk for 4 years and you produce your masterpiece. I'll be the first in the queue to buy that book and to applaud it. But if you're not writing that book, and what you're going to do is try and set a bunch of Romany people who are living in a particular street in London into your novel, you had better get your sand shoes on, take off your suit, get on the bus, and go and be with that community in every way that it's possible to be with them, so that everything that's in that novel has not just the ring of truth, but a deep, almost at the level of language, at the level of sentences, is going to be engaged with the moral universe that they are struggling within. That's why the research needs to happen, not just so you can get their names, you can get that off Google. And I would say to the younger novelists, you won't get that novel off Google. You'll get that novel off looking into the eyes of those children who are here only 3 years from Serbia, Herzegovina, trying to find a way to live in a community that hates them. Look in their eyes and listen to the daily rhythm of their lives, and then go and write your novel.
And those are the children whose eyes you've looked into.
Yeah, that's what I'm doing now, and I think that, it's cheeky to come here and read a few pages, but,
It's not.
In a way, if you're going to sing these songs, then you need to clear your throat, and you need to begin to test the tone of it. And for me, as you may well feel, your books are a bit like children. You feel proud of them, and you straighten their tie and wet down their hair and send them out into the world each time. But every time you start a book, you're starting from absolute scratch. Not having written a novel is no help to you when it comes to writing a new one, in my view.
Okay. Questions for Andrew O'Hagan. Nikki, please.
You've given us some fascinating contradictions there. When you were 23, you say you didn't know what you didn't know. And then you took us back to when you were 22
it's a question about how we know ourselves when we know ourselves, and I think this goes right back to Philippa's point earlier. You know, at 23, what did you think you know about yourself, and as you are now, what do you think about that 23-year-old and where you are? I mean, 20 years from now, are you going to look back and think, fuck, why did I write that big sprawling novel? I should have waited till I was 60.
I mean, it's consistent in my eyes. You know, I knew one thing. I knew that I had to go and ask people questions in order to write anything at all. My first book, The Missing, was based entirely on what we used to call pavement pounding. I went to Gloucester during the enormous revelations around the murders committed by, indeed, Frederick and Rosemary West. You know, I was a 23-year-old, I was standing in that street, Cromwell Street. The world's press was there, and I mean 400 people, with satellite vans and, you know, scrums and, you know, deals being made and, you know, checkbooks being produced. And I just stood there, and I waited, and I waited, and I waited. And eventually, there was nobody in the street except me and the policeman outside the house. I wasn't interested in the pornography of the violence. I wasn't interested in tabloid stories about the dismemberment of women. I wasn't interested in this sort of rather gladiatorial combat business of a serial killer versus women. What I was interested in was the fact that 13 of those women had gone missing and never had been reported as being missing. They all had families, doctors, boyfriends, educators. Nobody missed them. And only by staying there long enough did I start to speak to the people in the street, and did I start to build a picture of what had happened in our communities. So I didn't know anything. I just knew to ask, you know. But I think that was quite a big thing to know. And it wasn't self-defining, because there was a lot of moments of complete doubt when you're working on that kind of story. You think, Jesus, how, you know, because you see other people produce their stories in the papers, and I watched multiple big reveals of what was going on in that story, but waited, and it took 2 years or so before my book came out. But I think the thing is, you've just got to absolutely, fearlessly go outside and ask people stuff, and not imagine that you're in some superior ivory tower of discernment and intuition where you don't need to talk to human beings.
He's still asking. We are very glad that he is still asking. Please join me in thanking Andrew O'Hagan. Amazing.